Have you ever wished it was easier to connect with people, to get them to understand the passion you have for what you do as a dairy producer or out serving the industry? Do you wish you could get those around you, whether it's your employees, your neighbors, your own family, to be motivated by that same driving force that gets you out of bed every day? You wish you could tell them what drives you, what you're so passionate about, but it's really hard to put it into words. Well, I'm here to help you with this today in a conversation with fourth generation Pennsylvania dairyman Jared Kurtz. I'm heading out to the Pennsylvania Dairy Summit February 4th, 5th, and 6th to share a message inspired by the book Start with Why by Simon Sinek. And on this episode, you will not only get a chance to meet this ambitious young dairyman, but you'll get to listen alongside as I help him put his why into words, to articulate why he chose to come back to the dairy after seeking to get away from it, why he and his wife wanted farm life for their 6 children, why the transition planning process has been challenging but worth it, why he takes his responsibility seriously to engage with his community and educate others about their farming practices, and why he believes his farm serves a greater purpose. Hear all this today on the Up-Level Dairy Podcast. This is the podcast for dairy farm owners, managers, and advisors who are committed to profitability, sustainability, and excellence. I'm Peggy Coffeen, and it's my mission to bring you the conversations that will up-level your skill set and your mindset so you can be a top performer in the dairy farming business. And also, be sure to check the link in our show notes for the Center for Dairy Excellence and more information on the 2025 Pennsylvania Dairy Summit. Now, let's hear from Jared Kurtz. What was the dairy like before the expansion?
We were very much conventional. We had a 72 stall tie stall barn that my grandfather and dad had milked in, and my dad took over in the mid 80s. He kind of slowly grew that to the point where we were actually milking 3 times a day in there. We were milking about 120 to 130 cows, switching, letting cows out, bringing them in, milking 3 times a day, very labor intensive, and with an older barn. Didn't have great ventilation, not great cow comfort. So he was faced with a situation where if we wanted to continue to dairy, something had to change. It was either sell some of the cows and milk a lot less, or expand on the dairy side. At that point, more than double our herd. After a couple of years of visiting different farms and exploring, working with the transition team, transformation team, profit team through the center, that's the path that he ultimately went down, was to build an entire new facility with and install robots at that point. He had looked at retrofitting, and our facility just wasn't conducive to that. It wouldn't have been a good situation. So he built a new facility from the ground up, and that's where we've been since then. We actually still do milk at the tie stall barn. We milk about 60 to 65 cows there, and that's kind of where we take our low group, late lactation animals, and we only milk twice a day there. So it's much less labor intensive, but it's a facility that can be used. So we're still milking there the old fashioned way.
So when you have those days when you're like, man, I really miss switching 2 groups in a tie stall barn, you just go back.
So I can still scratch that itch. I haven't done quite as much milking there over the last year or two as what I had, but I mean, for my first 7, 8, 9 years back, I did pretty much every morning milking. It's not quite the demand it used to be, but I can still scratch that itch whenever I need to.
And so did you go to like college and then come back to the farm, or what was that path like for you?
No, I went to college to get away from the farm. Had zero intention of ever coming back. I mean, I always enjoyed it, but I saw some of the demands, and it wasn't necessarily a passion of mine. I enjoyed coming back and helping out with milkings and field work, but it wasn't really something that I was ever super passionate about. Then I went out and kind of tasted the other side. I worked for an excavating company for a couple years. I actually went and worked for a software company about 10, 15 miles east of us towards Philadelphia in an urban area. And I did that for 3 years. That was around the time that my wife and I got married, started a family, and quickly realized how much I missed the farm and being outside and this kind of work. So convinced my dad to let me come back. And here we are 11 years later.
Was there a moment when you remember being like, yeah, it's time to go home?
Around the time when my wife and I had our first son, we were renting a house on a neighboring farm right next door to ours that my dad was leasing and milking cows. So it kind of worked out. Even though I wasn't involved with the farm at all, we were living on one of the satellite farms, renting from the owner, kind of as a way to get involved with the farm and help cover some of our rent. I was helping my dad out some mornings and weekends, like mornings before I'd go into work. And each day it just got a little harder to leave the farm and go into my desk job. I enjoyed that, but took a step back and thought about doing that for my career for the rest of my life. It certainly didn't excite me the same way that getting up and coming out here and being involved with things on the farm did. So it's kind of a gradual process of spending more time out here again. And that was around the same time that he had built our new facility. Well, it's 11 years old, 12 years old now at this point. At that point, it was new with 4 Lely robots and that expanded our herd. So there was a lot of excitement at that point too, which certainly played a big role in me wanting to come back as well.
Now you've been back for going on 11 years. What's your typical day like now, and what responsibilities are on your plate?
So my dad and I, after my first couple of years here, we really worked together, and I've taken over, especially over the last 3 or 4 years, kind of more of the management ownership. But a lot of the day-to-day tasks, it changes from season to season often, and we both take turns covering the feeding, covering the robot chores. Most mornings we're still out here early getting started, whether I'm feeding or he's feeding or doing the robot chores. With the robots, I know some people have had challenges because they put them in and think you can almost just walk away. It's maybe less physical labor, but it's a lot more intensive management. You have to really learn how to work with the robots, understand the reports. I would say it takes a higher level of management. Even though we're not actually attaching the milkers to the cows, since you're not putting your eyes on the cows, like, okay, here's a cow that I know is sick. You have to rely on the reports to help you get that initial flag that there's something that's going on with the cow. Then go out and find her and give any kind of treatments. Now that I am in charge of more of the management, working on the books, paying bills, and setting up our budget planning, working with employees on different things, I'll say probably the biggest change from 10 and a half, 11 years ago to now is more outside of the farm with how much our family's changed since then. Had our son, he was about not quite a year old, and now we have 6 kids at home. And my wife homeschools most of them. So the demands at home sometimes also pull me there, just lend a hand, and whether I'm there for breakfast, lunch, or helping out with math or literature at some point throughout the day. It's been nice because throughout seasons with my dad and I, he's been able to step up when the demands are more at home, and we've had great help with our employees, so I can be a little bit more accessible to help my wife out in different times. And I've enjoyed that too, just to be able to be more involved with my kids on a day-to-day basis as well, or bring them out with me.
That's huge, right? Like being able to have that time to prioritize family stuff or bring the kids to the dairy with you. And so they get their lesson in technology, animal science, and data and all of that when they come to the farm with dad.
Yeah, they do. They get a firsthand, learning how to work. And my dad, if he's doing something as well, he'll bring one of the kids along sometimes. They've all spent plenty of time out here and learn how to scrape the crosswalks, clean stalls, or anything like that. They're not very old to do much beyond that, but they get to spend some time out here, which is definitely enjoyable.
What a great way to raise a family, right?
I agree.
So when your dad was going through the process of deciding to do the robots and expand, you weren't home yet, right?
No, I was not around or involved. There was a couple farms that I would visit with him. He never flat out said it. He always encouraged me to go check out other opportunities. But I'm sure he always did hope that in doing this, it'd be more appealing for me to come back and join him on the farm, which ultimately worked out. But yeah, I was not actually back on the farm working here at that point when he went through that process. I was involved sitting on some of the transformation team meetings and profit team meetings, but yeah, I was working elsewhere. That's where I spent most of my time. I was interested, but just not to the point where I actually wanted to commit my career and life to it at that point. But I was excited and proud of what was happening here. When I take a step back, that ultimately drove my decision to come back, being proud of what was happening here on the farm, what he had accomplished, and wanting to continue that.
Did it help you to see a future there too?
And at the time, I don't even really I maybe not fully understood the value of what he was doing to see that future. I take a step back now, and we've had this farm for almost 12 years at this point. It still feels like a new barn, and I know there's a number of other dairies in the area that haven't invested in new facilities in 20, 30, 40 years and are now at a crossroads. Maybe some of them are going to expand or put in new facilities. But when he did that, it really set us up to stay viable for a long time into the future. It was a huge capital investment, and that was 2013, and 2014 was great. After that, it was 4, 5, 6 years of challenge, which really stretched us. And there was times where we were like, okay, was that the right decision? And we really felt some of those pains. But now standing here 11 and a half years later, I am very grateful he took those steps because there is a viable future here now to have multiple families on the farm and be successful.
And you're in a unique area. You're kind of on the fringe of urban and very rural, right?
If you head east of us, we're one of the last. There are some dairy farms kind of between us and Philadelphia. New Jersey, obviously not a huge dairy state. There's a handful left there, but there's not a whole lot of dairying really between us and the Atlantic Ocean. We're kind of one of the furthest that way. If you go one county south, there's some decent sized farms that are probably about the same distance from Philadelphia. But between Harrisburg and Philly, there's not a lot of dairying. And we're right at the edge of that urban push outside of the city that's continuing to grow. 25, 30 years ago, there were 6 family dairy farms in our valley that we were all interconnected with. And now we're the only one that's still a dairy farm that's owned by the same family. There's one other that's still a dairy. It's owned by a different family. And then one other farm that's still owned by the same family, but they're not in the dairy industry. But since then, we've had multiple farms that have sold and housing developments have gone up, farms that have sold and gone to a shopping center, Walmart, Lowe's that are 500 yards from the edge of our property. So we're right in the middle of all that with restaurants. And then actually in the middle of our farm's split by the main street that runs right through our town. One of our farms, our original tie stall farm, is on one side of the street. Our new facility is down the road a couple hundred yards and on the other side of the street with the traffic light right at the end. We're also in a kind of a unique area that, land prices and land accessibility. I mean, it's crazy how hard it is.
If you were to go out and try and acquire some more farmland right now, how much an acre are you looking at?
Right around here, if you go 15 miles west, I'd say average right now is probably like 30,000 an acre. North from there, we're right on the edge of, some Amish and plain sect farms. It really drives a lot of the land values up significantly. That's not to say that every farm's that way, but as far as like good farmland, that's probably about what you're looking at right now. Thinking about how we interact with our community. We're very mindful of times of day and times of year when we're doing things and try and do things to be the absolute best neighbors that we can be with how we handle our manure. We started dragline injecting the vast majority of our manure, really cuts down on some smell. We have some unique challenges that other farms that have that, but it's in some ways, I think it's forced us to be as good of farmers as possible because we have so many eyes on us all the time. If something happens, everyone sees and everyone knows, and we can't hide behind anything. So it's really called us to be a higher, better level of farmer. It's also provided some unique opportunities because we are so close to Philadelphia and we have interstates that intersect at our town. We've been able to host a lot of tours over the years and bring a lot of people in to show them what a modern dairy facility looks like. We've been involved with Adopt a Cow program through the Center for Dairy Excellence this fall, and we were able to have, I think it was the third Saturday in November, hosted about 600 students and their parents on our farm for tours, and we've hosted breakfast on the farm before. It's been fun. That's something I really enjoy as well, is being able to show what we're doing. People really enjoy because a lot of people have no agriculture and especially no dairy background. For them to be able to come and see what we do and showcase that has been the highlight over the last 9, 10, 11 years.
And do they get particularly interested in the robots?
Yeah, everyone's absolutely amazed watching cows walk in and get milked by themselves. It's really hard for them to fathom how that works. We can access all of our animals on an app on our phone and track all their data. Most people leave pretty amazed at what happens on a dairy farm on a day-to-day basis. Oftentimes it's stuff that we take for granted to someone who doesn't have an understanding within the ag world. I think it's pretty mind-blowing.
It sounds like you've really enjoyed the opportunity to serve the community and educate. You guys have done a lot in the last 10, 11 years, really getting things humming and up to speed. What are you working on for 2025?
I think on the farm side, what we've really focused on the last 3-4 years, maximizing our production with the facilities that we have, the land that we have, so maximizing our forage production. We farm a little over 300 acres, and most of that we double crop with triticale and corn silage. We'll do some snaplage, but most of our grain we end up having to purchase because of the land that we have available to us. So having high producing forages and high yielding forages that can feed our cows, we're really trying to maximize our efficiencies and our performance across the board. About 3-4 years ago, we went through some big steps in our transition of ownership from my dad to my wife and I, from my parents to my wife and I. And so we've kind of taken the last 2-3 years to really dial that in, make sure that we have that process buttoned up. And I think we'll probably spend the next year or two to continue through that. We also have been looking at and working on for a couple of years, exploring the possibility of installing an anaerobic digester with co-digestion, bringing in some food waste as well. And that's been a longer process. We'll continue to work on that in 2025. Will we ever break ground? I don't know, but it's been in motion for a while. And so that's something that we'll probably continue to work on. But I can't say, for certain that like it's a goal to have that wrapped up and ready to go in 2025. But I think the biggest things are just continuing to improve upon what we're doing.
You mentioned the transition planning process. What stage would you describe where you're at right now?
I would say we've made it through most of the transition as far as overcoming most of the hurdles and having the hard conversations and kind of come up with a plan that works for us, for my parents, for my wife and I, where we kind of all have comfort in what we're doing to move forward. The thing that I really appreciate is that even though we've transitioned a decent amount of the technical ownership of the farm, my dad has been just as involved and invested as he always has. And I think that's one thing that's really worked out well for both of us, regardless of the phase. We both have been just as invested in the farm's success. And at the end of the day, both of our goals were to see the farm continue and stay in the family, and working through what that looked like. And it hasn't always been easy or pretty, or not that we've overcome every hurdle, but when we've had that end goal of keeping it here and in our family, and continue to do what we're doing, I think that does, when you have that ultimate end goal, you can work through some of the smaller things. And it takes time, and it's not easy. Not everyone necessarily wants that. And that's, every family is a little bit different, but that's what we've been able to work through over the last, honestly, our transition process has really started probably after I'd been back on the farm 2 or 3 years, but it really kind of accelerated here, I'd say, since 2020. And we really worked through a lot of it since the beginning of COVID. So yeah, I think that we're in a good spot now. Not that we have every wrinkle ironed out, but we're in a spot that we do feel very good as we head into the future for both of us.
You mentioned that you've gone through a lot of the hard conversations and had those discussions. What's the hardest conversation you guys have had in this process?
That's a really good question. I think there were times that we sat down and said, okay, is this what everyone wants, this kind of life, this lifestyle? And there were times when we all said, I don't know if this is what we can continue to do. I think there were some challenges specifically for us, like around housing. Where would we stay as our family grew, and finding a good home close to the farm or on the farm? That was a challenge. And 18 months ago, my parents actually moved out of the house that they had built. My wife and I did some renovations and moved in there with our family, just because as our family's been growing, our housing needs are probably a little bit more significant as far as the space and demands than theirs might have been without any kids at home for them. So they actually made the decision they moved off the farm about 1.5 miles down the road. That was definitely an adjustment for all of us, and it took some time. But if we hadn't fixed our housing situation, how much time, my wife is at home with the kids and homeschooling and everything, it has to be a good blend of what makes sense for me with my career, but also for my family. And as we've had those hard conversations, my parents' willingness to see what it was like living off the farm for the first time in my dad's life, that was a big step for them. And I think it's something that's worked out. We've been at this point for a little over a year. I think we all feel fairly comfortable with where we are.
So it sounds like it set you up with the resources to continue to move forward with this big part of your future. And that's having the plan, right? Having the plan for transition and succession, and ultimately success for your farm and your family, which sometimes we separate, but they're very much intertwined, aren't they?
That's a big thing we've really noticed. An emphasis for our family has been having our family connected and accessible, being involved in each other's lives, and being able to do that on the farm and close by most of the day. And it is very much intertwined with the business as well. And it's all looped into one, which a lot of times can be messy and complicated, but it's also really rewarding.
Well, I tell you, Jared, I'm really excited to make a trip to Pennsylvania this coming month in February for the Pennsylvania Dairy Summit. And you've been to this event, I'm guessing, a couple times, huh?
I've attended quite a few times. Couldn't really count at this point, but I've been to quite a few of the dairy summits.
And so State College is where it's at, February 4th, 5th, and 6th are the main days for this event. I'm pretty pumped because I get to visit you guys. And Jane and Emily have asked me to do an opener on that Wednesday morning. I'm going to be talking about the Start With Why concept, which is a book and a method of thinking from Simon Sinek. And so I'm going to take that concept and put it into some ways that are relevant to the dairy industry, to dairy farmers like you. And then we'll follow that up with a workshop at the conference as well. Are you familiar with Start With Why? Have you heard of this before?
I have not, actually.
So I'll give you a little snapshot of what it's all about. Start With Why. It's this concept that Simon Sinek talks about. It was a famous TED Talk from a few years back. What he really got to the root of was that we all have a why that drives us. And oftentimes when we talk about what we do, especially with our employees, our community, our family, even to ourselves, we focus what it is that we do and how we do it. But what he says is to really connect with other people and to help them connect on kind of a more emotional level. And that's getting into why you do what you do. I think that why comes up a lot in dairies when you're training new employees or somebody to handle cows in your robot barn. Have you found that you can tell them how to do it? You can tell them and teach them what to do. But if you can help them see why they're doing it, it makes a difference.
Absolutely. I mean, a ton of different areas on our farm. We need to take a step back and think about training employees. We can tell them to do a task and it can get done sometimes. But if you explain the importance of that task, or if it doesn't get done correctly, the ramifications, then yeah, certainly understand that analogy.
So the whole Start With Why at a most basic level for explaining the impacts of the way that you do things on the dairy. But to go a little bit deeper, it's how you get your team members engaged, how you communicate with the community that you are so close to in proximity, and also in your actions and the way you reach out to them. It's a way of helping to tell your story in a compelling manner. The other side of this is for you. And I'm going to play this into, I was just reading right now, my book that I'm starting the year with is The Purpose Driven Life. I don't know if you ever read it, but Rick Warren's Purpose Driven Life.
I think I was in college when I read that, but yes, it's been a while.
It's a good one. I read it every couple years. I just picked it up again this year to kick off the year. One of the things I was reading about this morning was how your passion can get you so far, but then you can get exhausted and burned out. That's why it's so important to be connected to a bigger purpose. That purpose gets you through the hard times when your passion starts to fade. When you're faced with challenges, that is what happens sometimes. That really is the root of Start With Why, kind of reconnecting to that purpose and putting it into some words. And that can be really challenging for people sometimes to put those deep thoughts into words, but that's what we're going to work on a little bit. And so you're my guinea pig this morning, Jared. So we'll walk through a little bit of what we're going to do in this workshop at Pennsylvania Dairy Summit. I am here to help you put those thoughts into some words and come up at the end with a statement that reflects your personal why. Are you ready to go through a little exercise with me?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
All right, I'll take the note. So when we really get into this why statement, the first place to start is looking backwards. And I know this can be challenging, especially for people that you're always looking ahead, planning in constant momentum and movement. But this is the part where I'm going to say, take a moment and let's look in the rear view. That rear view may go back the last 5 years. Maybe it goes back to when you were a kid, milking those 3 shifts and switching cows in the tie stall barn. I want you to think about some of the times in your life you have felt the most proud to be doing what you're doing.
As I've been thinking about this and reflecting back, are probably the moments when we were able to open our doors to our community and welcome a lot of people in and showcase what we do and share the story from our family, our heritage of being a farm that's been owned by the same family for 105 years, with me being the 4th generation, sharing that story, but also the story of the dairy industry, of the ways that we've, as an industry, been innovative. When I take a step back, there's moments when I can share that story and I can see people's faces light up, whether I'm talking to someone on our farm, seeing what we do, or even off the farm when I'm out in the community or at different events and get an opportunity to talk and That's part of that as well, as being able to, through different opportunities, talk to larger groups, talk to lawmakers, speak at different events, and be on panels and groups. And I think every opportunity that I have to share that story and showcase what we do as a farm family and as an industry, those are probably the highlights. To me, that's a big part of what it's about. If I think about it a little bit more and I take a step back, the reason that I can do that and have an opportunity to do that is because of what I do and what we do on the day-to-day basis. And so I think it's also taking pride in some of the smaller things, being proud of the way that we farm, being proud of the way that we treat our animals, the care that we provide for animals, the way that we care for our land, and improvements that we've made over the years. You think about the big moments that stick out, but for me, the foundation is paved in the day to day.
What I'm hearing from you is the foundation, as you said, is day to day. The fruition comes in those moments when you are able to showcase and communicate and connect with other people outside the industry about not just the story of your farm, but the story of your family and how that relates back. Is there something that really stands out in your mind of a time when perhaps someone came to your dairy and they had what you described as the face light up, right? When they learned something. Is there an example that has just stuck with you?
We had in November where a number of school students and their parents that came out for a Saturday morning and got to tour the facility and meet our cows. I think back to when we hosted a breakfast on the farm. We've had some smaller groups as well, lawmakers that we've been able to host and show as well. But I think really those larger events, when I see families coming and I see multiple generations together on our farm and have those conversations. And every now and then there'll be a grandparent or a parent that said, well, I grew up on a farm 30, 40, 50 years ago, or my grandparent had a farm and we did it this way. And it's just amazing to see what has happened. So I think a lot of those conversations.
Sounds like there's many of these moments that really resonate. You talk a lot about family. And so I'm just curious, when you've been able to host some of these large groups at the farm, have your kids been able to be a part of that now too?
That's a big part of why we do what we do. I think especially in the society that we live in today, where there's fewer opportunities for that, to be able to have something that my great grandparents down through me have done, and it's how it's done looks very different. But then also now that my kids are involved, that is a huge reason why I'm doing what we're doing today, to be able to pass that on to them, the heritage we have in our family of dairying and being involved in our community, to see them in small ways, understanding the ways they can. That just means so much. Absolutely.
When you think about some of the different tours you've hosted and events that you've been a part of on your dairy, whether it's communicating with kids, families, policymakers, sometimes there's those days where you're like, man, you're kind of exhausted, right? Going into something. But then when it's all said and done, like you realize that it is what energized you. Is there anything that sticks out in your mind of one of those events that you've been a part of where maybe going into it, you're like, everything went wrong this morning and I don't have time for this one more thing. But when it was all said and done, you're like, that was worth it. That's why I do what I do. Does that resonate?
Oh, it actually resonates very well. It's funny you say that. I mentioned that we're looking at a digester project. And as we've worked through that with our community, with our township, and how that could be structured, we actually just recently hosted a night where folks could come out and ask questions about it, trying to answer questions that people might have about a project like that, because we do live so close to so many people, hearing people's concerns and doing our best to answer any questions that they might have. Heading into something like that, you're not sure exactly how it's going to go. When you open yourself to the public to be scrutinized and ask the hard questions, there's definitely some nervousness. But I think throughout the evening, being able to have conversations with our neighbors and folks that are curious about the projects, hear their concerns, but also be able to share our story and why we see a project like this as a fit on our farm, and why we are even looking at it. To me, it's like, it reminds me of the story that we have and how different things looked 105 years ago. My great grandfather and great grandmother milked a handful of cows by hand twice a day, to where we are now. And I think as I plan for our future, it's going to look the way my kids and grandkids farm in this community that's growing like crazy around us is going to also look different. So yeah, that's a pretty recent example of something that when I left there that night, I actually did feel refreshed, just because of the being able to have those face-to-face interactions and and tell our story. And I'm sure some people still have questions and concerns, but knowing that we shared our story and gave that why we're looking at any kind of a project like this, it reminded me of why we are doing what we are doing.
Let's take this example and start with this one. The next part of coming up with your why statement is looking at the impacts on other people of these type of things. When you left that night from this meeting, what did you see as the impact that it had on the people in your community?
Even though we farm in the middle of our community, not everyone understands all that we do on a day-to-day basis. And then all that goes into our farming practices, our decisions that we make, and just don't really have any idea. I think one thing that's kind of a little unique about our farm is that the valley that we sit in, or there's 4 springs on farmland that we own or rent right around us that basically feed as the headwater to the Conestoga River, which feed down into the Susquehanna River and into the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And so as there's been an effort over the last 20 to 30 years of cleaning up the Chesapeake Bay watershed, we've in some ways taken that upon ourselves too. If water doesn't leave our farm clean as possible, it's not going to end up down there clean either. So we've implemented a lot of practices, double cropping, no-till farming, manure injection, stream bank fencing, riparian buffers, things like that, to really try and farm the best way that we can. And so I think as I take a step back and was able to share some of the why we're doing pursuing a project like this, it provided some context and understanding that a project with a digester and the positive environmental impacts of a project like that, and how that ties into a farm like ours. We have always farmed that way with an environmentally forward-thinking practices, to be able to share those practices that already are happening and tell that story to them and say, okay, this is how a project like this ties in with our heritage, and also as we plan for our future as well. Hopefully they understand a little bit of a greater understanding of what we do on a day-to-day basis. The things that we do on our farm are not done by accident. They're done very intentionally. Most people that drive by just think it's another farm, but just like every other farm out there, you don't accidentally do what you do any day. Any well-run, forward-thinking generational dairy farm is very intentional about all the decisions that they make.
So when you're able to communicate that and people in the community start to understand that there's such a bigger picture to what they see when they drive past your dairy, it comes down to intentional practices every single day, as well as intentional plans for the future, which is why you were at this meeting. Were there any of those aha moments, those eyes light up moments within the audience there that evening?
Yeah, there was definitely a couple conversations. One thing that I discussed with a couple people is this road that runs through our farm, with how busy it is. If you do a SWOT analysis of our business, that road is a threat. That's the reality. Even though we live on a farm that is an ag easement, is the development rights were sold and can't be developed, it'll stay a farm forever. It's to our viability as a farm family. Yes, it is a threat. Looking at a project where we would be incorporating food waste to our manure, so we could put a digester in, because we don't milk enough cows to have a manure only digester. What I'm doing is taking that road that is connected to the interstate that runs right through our farm. Thousands of cars go by every day. If I can easily truck in some of that food waste, it turns that threat into an opportunity for our operation. When I had an opportunity to share that with some folks, they're like, okay, yeah, I understand why you would pursue something like this. I got to provide some context for a project like this. There were other business owners involved. Most business owners are looking to kind of shore up or diversify their operation, and to provide some context as to why we're pursuing something like this. And based off facial expressions, I think that made an impact on a couple people, and certainly hope that it did. That one specific instance with this project, but also, like we talked about before, just being able to tell our story anytime that we've had that opportunity on the farm, off the farm. Some of those, getting that affirmation, that encouragement, those responses, that certainly is very rewarding.
So now we're going to try and put these pieces together. So we've talked about some of these stories that have been meaningful and have really helped you see the impact that you've been able to have through not just farming, but through doing it intentionally, and also inviting the community or getting out into the community to be a part of those stories and to help them see their own future as well as your future future too. The next step in creating the why statement is to put these pieces together. A why statement starts with to, and then the contribution, so that, and then the impact. To give you an example, what I always say is my personal why statement is to create and connect so that other people can see their God-given potential. And that's what drives me in the things that I do, whether it's through the podcast with my family or in the dairy youth that I coach. So that's the basic formula that we're going to put together for you, is to summarize a few of these keywords to create the statement. Here are some keywords that I heard from you about the contribution and impact. I heard you say words like connect, showcase, and educate. Would you agree that those are things that resonate with what you're doing?
Yeah, I definitely would. Absolutely.
Any one of those more than the other?
I would probably say the connect one is one that stands out. Part of the reason I say that is because I enjoy being around people person, extrovert, but a lot of times on the day-to-day, working on a smaller farm, I don't interact with a whole lot of other people. So I think to have those other connections really is something that at this phase of life really stands out.
I'm going to circle that word on my paper there, connect. When we talk about the impact, here's what I was noting as you talked about the impact is helping people to see not just the future of your farm, but you're connecting them to their future. When we say their future and your future, it's the farm, it's the families, yours and theirs, and it's community. To kind of put that together, impact is connecting people so that they can see a future for themselves, their families, and their community through your farm. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that would be very accurate with where we are now because of how physically close we are to the center part of our community. I mean, to kind of see the role that we play in all of that and showcase that, put that out there. I mean, I think that very much would be.
So there you have it. There's your why statement. To connect people so that they can see the future for themselves, their families, and your communities through your farm.
Honestly, I feel like that hits pretty close to home. I'm sure it would look different if our farm was located just a few miles away, but because of where we are located, I think that's something that we've kind of taken on and really does speak to a big part of our, specifically my day-to-day and how we farm and interact with our community around us.
So sit on that. I'll type it nice and send it to you so you have it. Hopefully a good, accurate description of what really drives you every day. And again, go back to the difference between passion and purpose, right? Like, you're passionate about what you do, but do you ever have days where you have to dig a little bit deeper and remember why you're doing it?
I think most people do, but I think even within the dairy industry, you might have to dig a little deeper some days when it's cold or have a down cow, sick calves, robots breaking down or whatever it may be, flat tires on tractors. There's days that you have to remind yourself why you're doing what you're doing and like you said, dig deep. So yeah, it certainly does resonate.
I'll follow up with you when I see you in a few weeks here, but I'll want to know, Jared, did that sink in? Does that still resonate? Is that something that feels true to who you are, what you're doing, but more importantly, why you're doing it every day? Do you think there's ways you could take this statement and use it as you're out doing your things, whether it's communicating with people on the farm or speaking out into the community?
Yeah, I think it's something that I've never really took the time to sit down and tie all this together in quite this way. Once I get it all in front of me, written down and put out there, I'm sure that I'll reference back to that. It just kind of adds another layer, reinforcement, a thought through layer of something that's almost become a part of what I do. Now it's like, okay, this really provides some definitive context and the thought through process.
Thank you for allowing me to do that for you. And this is like super fun for me. Like, I'm like a kid in a candy store getting to do this. So I'm very excited to get to bring this workshop and walk through others in Pennsylvania through the same thing at the Dairy Summit in February.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you taking the time and help me work through this. And again, hearing our story and then excited about connecting again. And I'll have to make sure that I follow through and keep this front of mind so I can report back in a couple weeks.
I hope so too. Jared, anything else you want to add today to our conversation?
I just want to thank you for what you're doing and telling the stories, helping farmers across the country. We all do it a little bit differently and slightly different purposes. And different opportunities, challenges, but knowing that at the end of the day, we're still working with these amazing creatures, these cows, and this land that we've been blessed with to live on and farm on. Hearing all the different stories is something that I really appreciate. Your gifting and sharing those is something that we've enjoyed. So thank you for doing that and pulling us in on this one too.
Well, it's the greatest honor that I have is to get to serve the people that work hard every day doing what you do. So thank you for that. It means a lot.
You just heard from Jared Kurtz here on the Uplevel Dairy Podcast. And if you want to come join us at the 2025 Pennsylvania Dairy Summit, make sure to check the link in our show notes for the Center for Dairy Excellence. I'm Peggy Coffeen, and I hope you've enjoyed this conversation today about starting with why and how putting your why into words can be a game changer for how you talk about what you do every day and motivate others to take action around you. And if you want more information from Uplevel Dairy Podcast, if you'd like to get episodes dropped in your inbox every week, make sure you head over to upleveldairy.com to join the Uplevel Dairy community. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Uplevel Dairy Podcast.